Before watching, please press like to support me in producing more stories. This helps in spreading the video and reaching more people. Thank you for your support and enjoy watching. The pine forest was thick and dark, but the air smelled fresh and crisp. I had parked my RV at Lakeview Campground, a cozy spot nestled among towering trees and near a serene lake in northern Minnesota. The plan was to spend a few days in nature, fishing, hiking, and just enjoying the solitude. You see, life back in the city had been a mess lately. I had recently gone through a bitter divorce, and the stress at work was through the roof. This trip was supposed to be my reset button, a chance to clear my head and figure out my next steps. The first day went smoothly. I woke up early, brewed some coffee, and sat by the lake watching the sunrise. Later I took my kayak out and spent hours fishing, catching a few bass and feeling the weight of the world lift off my shoulders. By evening I was feeling more at peace than I had in months. I grilled one of the bass for dinner, savoring the simplicity of it all. The campground was sparsely populated. There was an older couple a few spots down, and a young family with 2 kids on the other side of the lake. I waved at them when I arrived, but we hadn't exchanged more than a few words. I liked it that way. I wanted to be alone with my thoughts. That night, as I settled into my RV with a book, I heard a distant faint scream. I paused, listening intently, but the sound didn't repeat. I chalked it up to an overactive imagination and the eerie silence of the forest. I went to bed, falling asleep to the gentle rustling of leaves outside my window. The next day was more of the same, kayaking, fishing, and exploring the nearby trails. Around midday, I noticed something odd. The RV spot where the older couple had been was now empty. Their chairs and other camping gear were gone. I hadn't seen them leave, but I assumed they had packed up and moved on. It was strange, though, because I was sure I'd have noticed the sound of their engine starting up. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink, I decided to take a walk around the campground. The air was cool and refreshing, and the forest seemed alive with the sounds of crickets and distant owls. As I passed by the young family's campsite, I saw that their fire was still burning, but there was no sign of them. Maybe they were out for an evening hike or swim, I thought. I returned to my RV and settled in for another quiet night, but just as I was about to drift off, I heard it again. A scream, louder this time and definitely closer. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to hear any other sounds. Silence. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, the beam cutting through the darkness as I scanned the surrounding area. Nothing. Just the endless rows of trees and the faint shimmer of the lake in the distance. I told myself it was probably some animal, maybe a fox or a coyote, but the scream had sounded so human. Unease settled over me as I locked the RV door and lay back down, sleep evading me for hours. The following morning I noticed that the young family's campsite was also empty. The fire pit was cold, and their gear was gone. This time I knew something wasn't right. People don't just vanish without a trace. I decided to take a closer look around. As I walked through the campground, I found no sign of struggle or anything unusual. It was as if they had simply packed up and left in the middle of the night. I returned to my RV trying to make sense of it all. Maybe they had an emergency and had to leave quickly. But why wouldn't they at least leave a note or tell someone? The whole situation was starting to get under my skin. By midday, I decided to head into town to get some supplies and maybe report the disappearances to the local authorities. I needed to fill up the gas tank and pick up some more food anyway. The town was about an hour's drive away, and the road was winding and narrow. As I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. In town, I stopped at a small general store. The owner, a grizzled man in his 60s named Hank, greeted me with a nod. I told him about the strange occurrences at the campground, expecting him to brush it off. Instead, his expression grew serious. "You're not the first one to mention something odd out there," Hank said, his voice low. "A few people have gone missing over the years. Most of us locals avoid that area." "Why?" I asked, my curiosity piqued. "Some say it's cursed. Others think there's something more sinister going on. Either way, folks just up and vanish, no trace left behind." His words sent a chill down my spine. I thanked him and left, my mind racing. As I drove back to the campground, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over me. What if there was something or someone out there causing these disappearances? That evening, I decided to stay alert. I armed myself with a hunting knife I had brought along and kept my flashlight and phone close by. As the sun set and darkness enveloped the campground, I felt a sense of foreboding. The silence was thick, oppressive. Around midnight, I heard rustling outside the RV. I held my breath, listening intently. The sound grew closer, footsteps crunching on the gravel. My heart raced as I peeked through the window, the darkness outside impenetrable. Suddenly there was a loud bang on the door, followed by a man's voice. "Open up! I need help!" The voice sounded desperate, frightened. I hesitated for a moment before unlocking the door and opening it a crack. A man in his late 30s stood there, disheveled and out of breath. "Please, you have to help me. My family, they're missing." I opened the door wider, letting him in. "What happened?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "We were camping on the other side of the lake. I woke up and they were gone. I've been looking for them for hours. I heard a scream and saw your RV. Thought maybe you'd seen something." I told him about the screams I'd heard and the other campers who had vanished. His face grew pale. "We need to call the police," he said. "Something's not right here." We tried calling, but there was no signal. Typical in the middle of nowhere. The man, who introduced himself as Jared, suggested we drive into town together. I agreed, grabbing my keys and locking the RV behind us. As we walked to the truck, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The drive into town was tense. Jared kept glancing out the window as if expecting something to jump out at us. We reached the general store and I pounded on the door until Hank answered, bleary-eyed and annoyed. "What the hell's going on?" he grumbled. We explained the situation and his expression turned grim. "I'll call the sheriff," he said, heading to the phone behind the counter. The sheriff, a burly man named Tom, arrived about 30 minutes later. We told him everything, and he promised to investigate. He suggested we head back to the campground in the morning to look for any clues. Jared and I spent the night in the back of my truck, parked near the general store. Sleep was elusive, and every sound made me jump. By dawn, I was exhausted but determined to find out what was happening. We followed the sheriff back to the campground. The morning light made everything seem less ominous, but the sense of unease lingered. We started at Jared's campsite, finding nothing out of the ordinary. The tents were undisturbed, and there were no signs of a struggle. Next, we checked the spots where the other campers had been. Again, nothing. It was as if they had simply vanished into thin air. The sheriff looked perplexed, his brow furrowed. "We'll need to expand the search," he said. "I'll call in some more deputies and set up a perimeter. In the meantime, you two should stick together and stay alert." Jared and I agreed, spending the rest of the day helping the deputies search the area. As the sun began to set, we gathered around a campfire near my RV, exhausted and disheartened. "This doesn't make any sense," Jared said, staring into the flames. "How can people just disappear like this?" "I don't know," I admitted, "but I have a bad feeling about tonight." As darkness fell, the forest seemed to come alive with sounds. We sat in tense silence, listening to the crackling of the fire and the distant hooting of an owl. Suddenly, there was a rustling in the bushes behind us. We turned, shining our flashlights into the darkness. A figure emerged from the shadows, stumbling towards us. It was a woman, her clothes torn and dirty, her face streaked with tears. Jared rushed to her side, catching her as she collapsed. "Emily! Oh my God, Emily!" he cried, hugging her tightly. She was trembling, her voice barely a whisper. They took us all. We need to get out of here." "Who took you?" I asked, my heart pounding. She shook her head, unable to speak. Jared helped her into the RV, and we locked the door behind us. I handed her a bottle of water, and she drank greedily. "Can you tell us what happened?" the sheriff asked gently. Emily took a deep breath, her hands shaking. "We were sleeping. I woke up to a noise, saw figures moving in the trees. They grabbed us, dragged us away. I managed to escape, but the others, they're still out there." The sheriff's face grew hard. "We need to find them, now." We armed ourselves with whatever we could find, knives, flashlights, even a tire iron. The sheriff radioed for backup and we set out into the forest, following Emily's vague directions. The darkness was suffocating, and every snap of a twig made me jump. After what felt like hours, we came upon a clearing. In the center was a large, dilapidated cabin. The windows were boarded up, and the door hung loosely on its hinges. The sheriff motioned for us to be quiet as we approached. We could hear muffled cries from inside. The sheriff kicked the door open and we rushed in, flashlights cutting through the gloom. Inside, we found several people tied up, their faces bruised and scared. Among them were the missing campers and Jared's family. We untied them and they clung to us, thanking us through tears. As we led them out, I heard a noise behind us. I turned to see a man, tall and gaunt, standing in the doorway. His eyes were cold and empty, a knife glinting in his hand. "Run!" the sheriff shouted, drawing his gun. We scrambled out of the cabin, the man chasing us. The sheriff fired a warning shot, but the man didn't flinch. He lunged at the sheriff, and they grappled, the knife slashing through the air. Jared and I herded the others back towards the RV, but we were slowed by the underbrush and the darkness. I could hear the struggle behind us, the sounds of grunts and gunshots echoing through the trees. We made it back to the RV, and I started the engine, my hands shaking. Jared helped the others inside, and I floored it, the tires kicking up gravel as we sped away. In the rearview mirror, I saw the sheriff stumble out of the forest, bloodied but alive. We didn't stop until we reached the town, where we were met by more deputies and an ambulance. The sheriff was taken to the hospital, and the rest of us were questioned and treated for minor injuries. Emily and the other victims were reunited with their families, their ordeal finally over. As I sat in the back of the ambulance, a blanket wrapped around my shoulders, I couldn't help but think about the man in the cabin. Who was he? Why had he taken those people? The sheriff promised to find out, but for now we were safe. Jared thanked me, his eyes filled with gratitude. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been there," he said. "Me neither," I admitted, exhaustion finally catching up with me. The sun was rising, casting a golden glow over the town. It felt like a new beginning, a chance to move forward. As the ambulance doors closed, I took a deep breath, feeling a sense of relief wash over me. The nightmare was over, and I was ready to face whatever came next. I never did find out what drove that man to do what he did. The police said he was a drifter, someone who had fallen through the cracks of society. They found his body in the forest not far from the cabin, his eyes still open, staring into the void. "Out here, the wind can fool you into thinking you're not alone," I said to myself, kicking back on a weathered log and lighting a cigarette. The campsite at the edge of the dense forest had an eerie, almost oppressive silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. My name is Lyle Granger, and this RV camping trip was supposed to be a peaceful escape from my usual grind. Little did I know, the calm of the woods was just a deceptive prelude to the nightmare that awaited me. I had parked my RV at a secluded spot in the Ozarks, away from the usual camping crowd. The place had an appeal that was hard to resist. Untouched wilderness, a serene lake, and a promise of solitude. My plan was simple. Spend a couple of days fishing, hiking, and unwinding. On my first evening, I met a couple of fellow campers, Dean and Jackie, a pair of seasoned hikers with a knack for storytelling. They were friendly enough, sharing tales of their adventures and misadventures in the wild. We spent a good part of the night by the fire, swapping stories and laughs over a few beers. They warned me about the old abandoned cabin deep in the woods, a local haunt for curious teens and daring campers. "Stay away from that place," Jackie had said, her tone half joking, half serious. "It's got a history of people going missing." Despite the eerie tales, the first night passed uneventfully. The morning sun broke through the canopy, casting a golden glow over the campsite. I spent the day fishing by the lake, relishing the tranquility. The only oddity was the absence of wildlife noises. No birds, no squirrels, just the soft lapping of water against the shore. By late afternoon, I decided to explore the woods. Armed with a map and my trusty Swiss Army knife, I set off on a trail that supposedly led to a scenic overlook. The trail was well trodden at first, but soon gave way to a narrow, less traveled path. I followed it deeper into the forest, intrigued by the prospect of discovering something new. As I ventured further, the forest grew denser, the light dimmer. The path was barely visible now, covered in thick underbrush and fallen leaves. An hour into the hike, I stumbled upon a clearing with an old, dilapidated cabin at its center. "Must be the place Dean and Jackie mentioned," I muttered. The cabin looked like it hadn't seen a visitor in years. The wooden structure was partially collapsed, the roof sagging precariously. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to take a closer look. The door creaked open, revealing a dark interior filled with rotting furniture and debris. A strong, musty odor assaulted my senses, but I pushed on. Inside, I found remnants of what seemed to be camping gear, rusty lanterns, torn sleeping bags, and empty cans. But something else caught my eye. A trapdoor in the floor, slightly ajar. Against my better judgment, I lifted the door, revealing a ladder descending into darkness. Why the hell not, I thought, starting my descent. The air grew colder as I went down, and the darkness enveloped me completely. My flashlight beam cut through the blackness, revealing a small, underground room. It was surprisingly clean, with a cot, a table, and shelves lined with canned food and bottled water. "What the?" I whispered, realizing this was no ordinary campsite stash. I heard a shuffling noise behind me and spun around, heart pounding. The beam of light landed on a man standing at the base of the ladder, staring at me with a blank expression. His clothes were dirty and tattered, his face gaunt and unshaven. "Who the hell are you?" I demanded, backing away. "Shouldn't have come here," he replied, his voice a raspy whisper. Before I could react, he lunged at me. We struggled, his strength surprising given his frail appearance. In the chaos, I managed to shove him off and scramble up the ladder. I didn't look back as I bolted out of the cabin, sprinting through the woods until I reached my RV. Breathless and shaken, I locked myself inside the RV, my mind racing. Who was that guy? What was he doing there? I decided I needed to leave, but as I turned the key, the engine sputtered and died. "Damn it," I cursed, trying again with the same result. The RV was dead and I was trapped here. I spent the next few hours barricaded inside, listening for any signs of pursuit. Night fell and the forest outside turned pitch black. My flashlight flickered, casting long, eerie shadows. Just when I thought it was safe, I heard footsteps outside. Soft at first, then louder, closer. A pounding on the door made me jump. "Open up!" a voice commanded. It wasn't the same man from the cabin. I peeked through the window and saw two figures standing there, one of them holding a shotgun. "Who are you?" I shouted. "We're looking for a friend," the man with the shotgun replied. "He went missing near here." I hesitated, then opened the door slightly. "I haven't seen anyone," I lied. The man narrowed his eyes. "Mind if we take a look inside?" "Yes, I do mind," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "You need to leave." The other man, taller and bulkier, stepped forward. "We won't take long, just a quick look." Before I could respond, he shoved the door open and barged in. The two of them quickly searched the RV, finding nothing. As they turned to leave, the shorter man glanced at me. "If you see anything, let us know. People have gone missing around here." They left and I bolted the door again, my heart racing. Something was terribly wrong here. I couldn't stay another night. Grabbing a few essentials, I decided to make a run for it on foot. The nearest town was miles away, but I had no choice. As I stepped out of the RV, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the dirt near the cabin, partially hidden under leaves, was a human hand sticking out. I approached cautiously and uncovered the rest of the body. It was the man from the underground room, his neck twisted at an unnatural angle. Panic set in. I needed to get to safety and call the authorities. I started running through the forest, following the path as best as I could in the dark. Every sound made me jump, every shadow seemed like a threat. After what felt like hours, I saw the faint glow of lights ahead. I burst into the clearing where Dean and Jackie had their camp. "Help!" I shouted, out of breath. They emerged from their tent, alarmed. "What's going on?" Dean asked. "There's a body," I panted. "Back in my camp. We need to call the cops." Dean and Jackie exchanged worried looks but didn't hesitate. Dean grabbed his phone and dialed 911, explaining the situation. The operator assured us help was on the way. As we waited, I told them everything. About the man in the underground room, the guys with the shotgun, and the body I found. Jackie listened intently, her expression grim. "We should stay together until the cops arrive," she said. Minutes felt like hours, but eventually the distant wail of sirens broke the silence. A couple of patrol cars pulled up, and officers emerged armed and alert. They questioned me thoroughly, then headed to my campsite to investigate. I stayed with Dean and Jackie, my nerves shot. When the officers returned, their faces were somber. "We found the body," one of them confirmed, "and evidence of a struggle inside the cabin. We're going to need you to come with us to the station for a full statement." I agreed, eager to get out of the woods. Dean and Jackie offered to follow in their car. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The man in the underground room, the strangers with the shotgun. There were too many unanswered questions. At the station, I gave my statement, detailing everything I had seen and heard. The officers took it seriously, promising to investigate further. They also informed me that there had been reports of missing persons in the area over the past few years, all under similar circumstances. Exhausted and still on edge, I was finally allowed to leave. Dean and Jackie offered me a place to stay for the night, which I gratefully accepted. As we drove to their home, I couldn't help but think about the man in the underground room. What had he been doing there? And who were those other men? The next morning I woke up to the sound of Dean's voice. "Lyle, you need to see this," he said, handing me his phone. There was a news article about the discovery of the body and the mysterious circumstances surrounding it. The police were now treating it as a potential homicide. Over the next few days, the story gained traction. Reporters swarmed the area, and the police continued their investigation. They discovered more bodies buried near the cabin, all in various stages of decomposition. It was a chilling revelation that pointed to a serial killer operating in the area. I stayed with Dean and Jackie until the investigation was complete. The police eventually identified the man in the underground room as one of the missing hikers reported months ago. The other bodies were also identified, all linked to missing person cases over the past few years. Despite the gruesome discoveries, the killer remained at large. The men with the shotgun were never found, and their connection to the murders was never fully established. It was a mystery that haunted the community, and one that I would never forget. As I prepared to leave town, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. The ordeal had been a harrowing experience, but it had also brought me closer to Dean and Jackie, who had been incredibly supportive throughout. I thanked them for their hospitality and promised to stay in touch. Driving away, I glanced back at the forest one last time. The memories of that night would always stay with me, but I was determined not to let them define me. Life goes on, and I had a newfound appreciation for the simple, everyday moments that we often take for granted. The last thing I saw in my rearview mirror was the fading silhouette of the trees, standing tall and silent as ever. I can't shake off the memory of that eerie night in the Nevada desert. I'd been looking forward to this trip for months. Ever since I bought my RV, I'd been eager to test it out in the vast open spaces of the American West. It was supposed to be a relaxing escape from my routine, a chance to enjoy some solitude under the stars. I'm Jackson Carr, a guy who's always found comfort in the wilderness. Growing up in a crowded city, I yearned for the peace that only nature can offer. My first camping trips were with my grandfather, who taught me how to navigate the woods and respect the land. Those memories are what drove me to take this trip in the first place. I'd picked a spot well off the beaten path, near an old abandoned mining town called Rhyolite. The desert stretched endlessly around me, a stark beauty that seemed both inviting and desolate. I'd set up camp early in the day, positioning the RV to catch the best view of the sunset over the distant mountains. The evening started as you'd expect. I grilled some steaks, had a couple of beers, and watched the sky turn from bright orange to deep purple. The isolation was exactly what I needed. The air was cool, the silence profound, save for the occasional rustle of a desert breeze. As night fell, I decided to take a walk around the area to absorb the serenity and maybe spot some wildlife. Armed with just a flashlight and my trusty old hunting knife, more for comfort than necessity, I set off into the desert. The first sign of trouble came as a distant flicker of light, barely noticeable against the dark canvas of the night. At first I thought it might be another camper, but it was too erratic for that, moving in unpredictable patterns. My curiosity piqued. I headed in its direction. The light led me to what seemed like an old dilapidated structure, probably a remnant of Rhyolite's mining days. It was eerie, standing alone in the moonlight, but my intrigue outweighed my caution. As I approached, I could see the light more clearly. It was a lantern hanging from a hook just inside the doorway. "Hello," I called out, expecting to find some fellow traveler or maybe a local exploring the ruins. Silence was my only response. I stepped inside, my flashlight revealing a scene straight out of a horror movie. The place was littered with old tools, broken furniture, and an overwhelming sense of abandonment. That's when I heard the first sound, a soft scraping like metal against stone. I swung the flashlight towards the noise but saw nothing. My heartbeat quickened. I'm not easily spooked, but there was something about that place that set me on edge. I took a few more steps inside, scanning every corner, when I noticed a small door in the back, partially open. With my flashlight in one hand and my knife in the other, I pushed the door open. The room beyond was even more unsettling. It looked like it had been used recently. There were fresh footprints in the dust and what looked like bloodstains on the floor. My mind raced. Who the hell was here? A sudden creak behind me made me spin around. The lantern I had seen was now swinging wildly, casting crazy shadows on the walls. And then, I saw him. A tall, gaunt man standing in the doorway, blocking my exit. His clothes were ragged and his face was obscured by a hood. He didn't say a word, just stood there watching me. "Who are you?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. No response. He just stepped closer, the dim light reflecting off something metallic in his hand. A knife. I took a step back, realizing I was cornered. My only way out was through him. "Listen, I don't want any trouble," I said, trying to sound calm. "I'll just leave, and you can have this place to yourself." Again, no response. Instead, he lunged at me, and I barely had time to react, slashing at him with my own knife. The blades clashed, and I felt a sharp pain as his knife grazed my arm. Instinct took over. I fought back with everything I had, adrenaline pumping through me. The man was strong, but I was desperate. I managed to knock him back, using the flashlight as a blunt weapon. He stumbled, giving me a split second to run. I bolted out of the building, not daring to look back. The desert night, once serene, was now a terrifying maze of shadows and sounds. I ran towards my RV, my breath coming in ragged gasps. When I reached it, I locked the doors and grabbed the shotgun I kept for emergencies. My hands were shaking, but I was ready to defend myself if he followed me. Minutes passed like hours. I peered out the windows, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. Nothing. Just the silent desert. My mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion. Who was that guy? What was he doing out here? The rest of the night, I stayed alert, barely moving from my spot. When dawn finally broke, I cautiously stepped outside, the shotgun still in my hands. The light of day made everything seem less threatening, but I knew better than to let my guard down. I decided to pack up and leave. Whatever had happened out there, I didn't want to stick around to find out more. As I was securing the last of my gear, I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine, footprints in the sand, leading from the RV to the old building and back. Fresh footprints. He'd been watching me, following me. I didn't waste any more time. I fired up the RV and drove out of there as fast as I could. The desert, once a place of peace and solitude, had turned into a nightmare. The drive back to civilization felt like an eternity, every shadow and every passing car setting me on edge. When I finally reached a town, I went straight to the local sheriff's office. I told them everything, showed them the cut on my arm as proof. They took my statement seriously, which was a relief, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes. "Rhyolite's been abandoned for decades," the sheriff said. "No one's supposed to be out there. We'll send someone to check it out, but it's probably just some drifter or prankster. But I knew what I saw. I knew the danger was real. I left the sheriff's office with a sense of unease that I couldn't shake. I'd survived the night, but the memory of that man and his knife haunted me. It was a reminder that even in the vast openness of the desert, there are places and people best left undisturbed. As I drove away from the town, I made a vow to myself. No more solo camping trips in remote areas. The wilderness might offer peace, but it also harbors its own kind of danger, one that I wasn't eager to face again. Back at home, I patched up my arm and tried to return to normal life, but the experience had changed me. It was a brutal reminder of the fragility of safety, how quickly things can go wrong. I found myself double-checking locks, jumping at unexpected sounds. The freedom I once found in solitude was now tainted by fear. I never heard back from the sheriff's office, and part of me was relieved. I didn't want to know if they found anything or anyone out there. It was enough to know that I had escaped with my life. In the end, I learned a harsh lesson about the allure of isolation and the reality of human threats. The desert, with its silent beauty, had shown me a darker side, one that I wouldn't soon forget. My RV still sits in the driveway, a reminder of the trip that went horribly wrong. Maybe one day I'll venture out again, but for now, the open road doesn't call to me as it once did. The wilderness is a place of wonder, but it's also a place where you can find yourself face to face with danger, with no one to hear your cries for help. And that's a lesson I won't ever forget. I never thought much about the solitude of RV camping until I found myself in the middle of the Arapaho National Forest. Miles from any semblance of civilization, it was just me, my RV, and the sprawling wilderness. My name's Ellis Grady, and I've always been a bit of a lone wolf, finding solace in the isolation of nature. This trip was supposed to be a break from the chaos of daily life, a chance to unwind and maybe do some hunting. I parked my RV in a secluded spot near a small, crystal-clear stream that cut through the forest. The trees, tall and dense, seemed to guard my little haven from the world. Setting up camp was routine by now, leveling the RV, unhooking the ATV, and securing my hunting gear. The air was fresh, filled with the scent of pine and the distant call of birds. Perfect, I thought, for a few days of peace and quiet. After a simple meal of canned beans and beef jerky, I decided to explore the area on my ATV. The rugged trails wound through the forest, occasionally opening up to stunning vistas of the Rockies. It was exhilarating, the engine's roar echoing off the mountains. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, I headed back to camp. The night crept in quickly, the temperature dropping as darkness enveloped the forest. I lit a small fire, its flickering light casting dancing shadows on the trees. Sitting by the fire, I felt the familiar comfort of solitude. It was just me and nature. No distractions, no noise. But as the hours passed and the fire died down, an uneasy feeling began to settle in. The forest, usually so full of life, seemed eerily silent. I brushed off the feeling as just nerves and went inside the RV to sleep. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and adding to the sense of unease. I tried to focus on the sounds of the forest, hoping it would lull me to sleep. But a sudden sharp noise jerked me awake. It sounded like something heavy being dragged across the ground outside. I grabbed my flashlight and my hunting rifle, stepping out into the cold night air. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the area around the RV. Everything seemed in place, but the noise had definitely come from somewhere close by. I circled the RV, my heart pounding, but found nothing. Eventually, I chalked it up to my imagination and went back inside. The next morning, I decided to take a longer hunting trip, hoping to shake off the unease from the previous night. I packed my gear, strapped my rifle over my shoulder, and set off on foot. The forest was beautiful in the morning light, the sun filtering through the trees and casting dappled shadows on the ground. I tracked deer for a while, the thrill of the hunt taking over my senses. Hours passed, and I found myself deep in the forest, farther than I'd intended to go. As I prepared to turn back, I stumbled upon something strange. There was a clearing, and in the center, a large wooden structure that looked like a makeshift cabin. It was crudely built, with logs and branches haphazardly stacked together. Curious, I approached cautiously. Inside, the cabin was empty except for a few pieces of old, worn furniture and a rusted metal box. The air inside was musty, and it felt like no one had been there for years. I pried open the box, finding nothing but some decaying papers and a rusty knife. As I was about to leave, a chill ran down my spine. I had the distinct feeling I was being watched. I quickly exited the cabin and started back towards camp, the sense of unease growing with every step. The forest, which had seemed so inviting earlier, now felt oppressive, the trees closing in around me. As I neared my camp, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were fresh footprints in the dirt leading straight to my RV. I crouched down, examining the prints. They were large, and there were signs of a struggle. My mind raced with possibilities. Had someone followed me? Or worse, was someone waiting for me at my camp? I tightened my grip on my rifle and approached cautiously. The RV door was slightly ajar, and I could hear faint noises coming from inside. I burst through the door, gun raised, ready for anything, but what I saw froze me in my tracks. A man, disheveled and wild-eyed, was rifling through my supplies. He turned to face me, a crazed look in his eyes. Before I could react, he lunged at me, a rusted knife clutched in his hand. I fired instinctively, the gunshot deafening in the confined space of the RV. The man crumpled to the floor, the knife clattering away. My heart pounded as I stood there, the reality of what just happened sinking in. I had just killed a man. I checked his pulse to confirm he was dead, then stepped back, my mind racing. Who was he? Why was he in my RV? I searched his pockets, finding a crumpled piece of paper with a list of names and dates. My name was on the list, dated for today. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. He had been hunting me. I needed to get out of there. Fast. I grabbed my essentials, threw them into the RV, and started the engine. The tires kicked up dirt as I sped down the narrow forest path, my mind still reeling from the encounter. As I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Who was this guy, and why was he after me? Back on the main road, I drove straight to the nearest town, a small, sleepy place called Granby. I went to the local sheriff's office, still in shock from what had happened. I explained everything to Sheriff Logan, a grizzled man in his 50s with a no-nonsense attitude. He listened quietly, taking notes. "We'll need to investigate the site," he said. "You said you found a cabin? Can you take us there?" I nodded and we set off, the sheriff and 2 deputies following me in their patrol car. The drive back to the camp was tense, the weight of what had happened hanging heavy in the air. When we arrived, the sheriff's men secured the area while I led him to the cabin. It was exactly as I had left it, but now it felt even more sinister. The sheriff examined the place, then turned to me. "This cabin isn't on any maps. It's like it doesn't exist." We returned to the RV, where the deputies had already begun examining the body. They found more papers in his pockets, but none of them made any sense. It was a jumbled mess of symbols and drawings, like something out of a madman's diary. "Looks like we've got a real nutcase on our hands," the sheriff muttered. "We'll take it from here, Ellis. You should get some rest." I nodded, too exhausted to argue. I drove back to Granby and checked into a motel. I lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to process everything that had happened. My solitude, once a source of comfort, now felt like a prison. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of danger lurking just out of sight. The next morning I received a call from the sheriff. They had identified the man. His name was Walter Brackett, a drifter with a history of mental illness and violent behavior. He had been linked to several missing persons cases in the area, but they never had enough evidence to charge him. It seemed he had been living in that cabin, hunting campers and hikers who ventured too close. "You're lucky to be alive," the sheriff said. "We found more names on that list. We're contacting their families now. If you hadn't acted, who knows what he would have done." I thanked him and hung up, the weight of his words sinking in. I had survived, but the experience had left a mark on me. The forest, once a place of peace and solitude, now held a darker memory. I packed my things and left Granby, heading back to the city. As I drove, I couldn't help but glance at the trees lining the road, half expecting to see a figure watching me from the shadows. But I pushed the thought away, focusing on the road ahead. The mountains faded into the distance, replaced by the familiar sights of civilization. I didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. I would never forget my time in the Arapaho National Forest, the solitude that almost became my undoing, and the madman who turned my peaceful retreat into a nightmare. There's something unsettling about the smell of pine trees and campfire smoke that hits you first thing in the morning. Not that I was expecting anything strange, just a regular weekend out RV camping in the forests of Maine. My name's Jebediah Stroud, and for the past few years I've taken these trips to clear my mind. Helps me deal with the stress, you know. This time, though, turned out different. Woke up to the crisp air of the outdoors, a mix of last night's ash and the freshness of dew. After a quick stretch and a half-hearted attempt at a morning jog, I decided it was time to explore a bit deeper into the woods. Now, I'm no survival expert, but I know enough to not get myself lost or eaten by a bear. Besides, I had my trusty compass and a decent sense of direction. The morning hike started off pretty normal. Birds chirping, the rustle of small critters in the underbrush, and the occasional deer sighting kept things interesting. About an hour in, I stumbled across a trail that seemed less traveled. Intrigued, I decided to follow it. The path was narrow, flanked by dense shrubbery and tall trees that almost formed a canopy above me. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. Eerily quiet. I pressed on, curiosity pushing me forward. The further I went, the more I noticed signs of human activity. An old, rusted-out truck partially hidden by overgrown vines, and a dilapidated cabin that looked like it hadn't seen inhabitants in decades. The place was creepy, sure, but it piqued my interest. I approached the cabin, peering through the grime-covered windows. Inside, it was as expected. Dusty, abandoned, with furniture that had long since given up on being useful. But there was something odd about the scene. A recent-looking footprint on the dusty floor. I had no intention of turning into some amateur detective, but something was off. Deciding I'd had enough of the spookiness, I turned to leave. That's when I heard it. A faint but distinct sound of movement inside the cabin. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, trying to convince myself it was just an animal. Then the door creaked open slowly, and a figure emerged. "Hey, who's there?" I called out, trying to sound more confident than I felt. The figure stepped into the light, and I saw him clearly. A disheveled man, probably in his late 40s, with wild hair and eyes that looked like they hadn't known sleep in a while. He held a rusty knife, his grip tightening as he saw me. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice shaky but threatening. "This is private property." "Easy, man," I replied, trying to keep things calm. I didn't know anyone was here, just out camping and exploring. The man didn't seem convinced. He took a step forward, and I noticed the glint in his eyes. Pure desperation mixed with a hint of madness. I slowly backed away, not wanting to provoke him, but my foot caught on a root, and I stumbled. That's when he lunged at me, knife aimed right at my chest. I managed to roll to the side just in time, scrambling to my feet as he regrouped for another attack. Instinct kicked in. I grabbed a thick branch from the ground and swung it at him, connecting with his arm. He howled in pain, dropping the knife. Taking advantage, I pushed him to the ground and ran. I didn't stop until I was back at my RV, heart pounding and lungs burning. Locking the door, I tried to collect my thoughts. What the hell was that? Who was he, and why was he living out there? Questions buzzed in my mind, but I knew one thing for sure. I needed to get the hell out of there. Grabbing my keys, I started the RV and sped down the dirt road, kicking up dust and leaves behind me. As I drove away, the adrenaline began to wear off, replaced by a creeping sense of dread. What if he followed me? I kept checking my mirrors, but the road remained clear. Eventually I reached a small town, and I pulled over at a diner, needing to calm my nerves and figure out my next move. Inside, the warm air and the smell of frying bacon did little to ease my anxiety. I ordered a coffee and sat in a corner booth, replaying the morning's events in my mind. That's when I noticed a flyer on the bulletin board near the counter. It was a missing persons notice, 3, in fact, all with pictures of people who had vanished in the last year. The descriptions fit the area I was camping in. I felt a chill run down my spine. Could that guy have something to do with these disappearances? The thought gnawed at me, but I wasn't about to play hero. I decided to report what I saw to the local authorities. Maybe they'd piece things together. The sheriff's office was a modest building not far from the diner. Inside, I recounted my story to a deputy, leaving out no details. The man's crazed look, the knife, the cabin. The deputy listened intently, jotting down notes. "Sounds like you had a close call," he said, looking up from his notepad. "We've had reports of a squatter out there, but nothing solid. We'll send a team to check it out. You did the right thing coming to us." I thanked him and left, feeling a mix of relief and lingering unease. As I walked back to my RV, I couldn't shake the image of that man's face. Something told me this wasn't over. Sure, I'd done my part, but what if he came looking for me? I decided to cut my trip short and head back home. Driving through the winding roads, I kept an eye out for any signs of trouble. The forest that once felt like a peaceful retreat now seemed menacing, each shadow hiding potential threats. By the time I reached the highway, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the landscape. I pushed the RV to its limits, wanting to put as much distance between me and that place as possible. A few hours later, I pulled into my driveway, exhausted but glad to be home. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment, collecting my thoughts. The events of the day played back in my mind like a bad movie. I knew it would take a while to shake off the feeling of unease. Days turned into weeks, and life slowly returned to normal. I followed up with the sheriff's office, but there wasn't much progress. They found the cabin and evidence of someone living there, but the man was gone. It was like he vanished into thin air. The missing persons cases remained unsolved, and the whole thing started to feel like a bad dream. One evening, as I was sitting on my porch, a thought occurred to me. What if he was still out there, waiting for his next victim? The idea sent a shiver down my spine. I knew I had been lucky to escape with my life. The world can be a dangerous place even when you least expect it. The next day I bought a gun. The first time I heard about Deadwood Valley, it sounded like the perfect escape. Nestled somewhere between nowhere and everywhere, the valley promised solitude, which I craved after months of grinding through city life. My name is Garrison Wolfe, and I decided an RV camping trip would be the perfect remedy. I packed up my RV, gassed it up, and set out for a much-needed retreat into the wilds of Montana. Deadwood Valley was beautiful, surrounded by mountains and thick forests with a clear river running through it. The campgrounds were sparse, just a few plots scattered among the trees, which meant privacy. I found a spot near the river, set up camp, and felt the tension in my shoulders ease for the first time in months. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows when I noticed another RV pulling in a few plots down. A man stepped out, tall and muscular with a bald head that gleamed in the fading light. He looked like he had seen his fair share of tough times. I nodded at him, and he gave a curt nod back before disappearing into his RV. The evening was uneventful, and I spent it by the campfire, roasting marshmallows and enjoying the tranquility. But just as I was about to turn in, I heard a scream, sharp and cut off abruptly. My heart raced. I grabbed my flashlight and headed towards the sound, hoping it was just an animal. I found nothing unusual, but the eerie silence that followed was unsettling. Back in my camp, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Sleep was fitful, and every rustle of the leaves outside felt like a whisper of danger. The next morning, I decided to go fishing. The river was teeming with trout, and I lost myself in the rhythm of casting and reeling. It wasn't until late afternoon when I headed back, eager to cook my catch. As I approached my RV, I noticed something odd, a small, bloody handprint smeared on the side. My heart pounded as I looked around, but no one was in sight. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself it was probably just some prank. I cleaned the handprint, but the unease lingered. That evening, I met the man from the other RV. His name was Rick Jablonski, and he seemed friendly enough, but there was something off about him. His eyes darted around, never quite meeting mine. We shared a beer, and Rick talked about his love for the outdoors, but his stories were interspersed with strange, almost macabre anecdotes about people going missing in the woods. His laughter after each tale felt forced, a little too loud. I chalked it up to nerves or an overactive imagination. After Rick left, I decided to take a walk, hoping to clear my mind. I wandered deeper into the woods, the shadows growing longer and more sinister. I stumbled upon a clearing where the grass was trampled and the earth stained dark. A shiver ran down my spine as I realized it was blood. Panic set in. I hurried back to my camp, only to find my RV door ajar. Inside, it looked like a tornado had hit. Everything was tossed around and my fishing gear was missing. I grabbed my phone to call the authorities, but found it dead, the battery drained. Without a working phone, I felt cut off from the world. I decided to confront Rick, suspecting he knew more than he let on. I stormed over to his RV, but it was empty. No sign of him anywhere. As I turned to leave, I spotted something glinting in the grass, a bloody knife. Fear gripped me. I grabbed the knife, wrapped it in a cloth, and headed back to my RV. I locked myself inside, barricading the door with whatever I could find. The sun had set, and the darkness outside felt alive, pressing against the windows. Sleep was impossible. Every creak and groan of the RV had me on edge. Around midnight, I heard footsteps outside. I peeked through a crack in the window and saw Rick standing motionless, staring at my RV. His expression was blank, almost mechanical. I watched in horror as he slowly walked around my RV, tapping the windows with the handle of an axe. My breath caught in my throat as he circled, methodical and relentless. I knew I couldn't stay inside. I had to make a run for it. I slipped out the back, moving as quietly as possible towards the woods. The darkness swallowed me, and I forced myself to stay calm, moving deeper into the trees. Behind me, I heard Rick calling out, his voice echoing through the night. "You can't hide, Garrison. I will find you." I stumbled through the woods, branches scratching my face and arms. My only thought was to get away, to find help. I reached the river and followed it upstream, hoping to find another camper or a ranger station. But the woods were empty, and the feeling of being hunted gnawed at me. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. It was hard to tell. My legs burned and exhaustion set in. I found a large rock to hide behind and tried to catch my breath. The forest was silent, but I knew Rick was out there, searching. I must have dozed off because I was jolted awake by the sound of splashing water. I peeked around the rock and saw Rick crossing the river, heading straight towards me. My heart raced, and I knew I had to keep moving. I slipped away, careful to leave no trail. Dawn was breaking when I stumbled upon an old, abandoned cabin. It was dilapidated, but offered some semblance of shelter. I slipped inside, barricading the door as best I could. Inside, it smelled of rot and decay, but I didn't care. I just needed to rest. I was awoken by the sound of Rick's voice closer than ever. "Come out, Garrison, let's end this." My mind raced. Why was he doing this? What did he want? But there was no time for answers, only survival. I searched the cabin for anything I could use as a weapon. I found a rusted shovel and gripped it tightly. The door rattled as Rick tried to force it open. I positioned myself behind the door, ready to strike. The door burst open and Rick charged in. I swung the shovel with all my might, catching him in the side of the head. He stumbled but didn't go down. We struggled, the small space making it hard to move. Rick was strong and I was losing ground. In the chaos, I managed to knock the axe from his hand. It skidded across the floor, out of reach. We grappled, and I felt his hands around my throat, squeezing the life out of me. Desperation gave me strength, and I kicked him hard, sending him crashing into the wall. I grabbed the axe and swung wildly, the blade biting into Rick's shoulder. He screamed, a sound that echoed through the cabin. Blood splattered, and he fell to the floor, writhing in pain. I stood over him, the axe raised, ready to finish it. Rick looked up at me, his eyes filled with rage and something else, fear. "Do it," he spat. "End it. but I couldn't. I dropped the axe and stumbled back, the adrenaline leaving me shaky and weak. Rick lay there bleeding out, his breathing ragged. I backed away out of the cabin and into the light of the rising sun. I made my way back to my RV, my mind numb. I found my phone, miraculously charged enough to call for help. The authorities arrived and I led them to the cabin. Rick was gone, but the blood stains and the axe were proof enough. The investigation that followed was a blur. They found Rick's RV abandoned, with evidence linking him to several missing persons cases. He had been a drifter, moving from campground to campground, leaving a trail of bodies. They never found Rick, but I knew he was out there, somewhere. The thought of him still haunts me, but I refuse to let it control my life. I returned to the city, changed but not broken. Life goes on, and so do I. If there's one thing I always looked forward to, it was my annual RV camping trip. This year I decided to explore the backwoods of Oregon, far from the bustle of everyday life. My name's Felix Reinhardt, and I've had my fair share of hard knocks. Lost my business 5 years ago, my marriage soon after, but this trip was my solace. Just me, nature, and the hum of my RV. The morning was crisp, and the forest vibrant with early autumn colors as I set up camp by a secluded lake. I could hear the distant gurgle of a stream and the rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze. After a quick breakfast, I decided to hike a nearby trail that supposedly led to an old abandoned cabin. I'd always been curious about places like that, remnants of lives lived long ago. I packed a small day bag with water, some snacks, a map, and a flashlight, and set off. The trail was barely visible, more of a suggestion than a path, but it had that allure of adventure that I craved. Birds chirped overhead, and the occasional rustle in the underbrush hinted at small critters scurrying away. About an hour in, the trail started to climb steeply. The trees grew denser, and the light dimmed, but I pressed on. Eventually, the cabin came into view. It was a decrepit structure leaning to one side, its windows broken, and door hanging off one hinge. The air around it was still, almost too still, but I brushed off the unease that began to creep into my mind. I pushed open the door and it creaked loudly, echoing through the silence. Inside, the air was musty, filled with the scent of decay and abandonment. The interior was sparse, an old table, a few chairs, and a fireplace blackened with soot. I snapped a few pictures with my phone, thinking they'd make great additions to my travel blog. As I explored further, I noticed a trap door in the floor, partially concealed by a tattered rug. Curiosity piqued. I pulled the rug aside and lifted the trap door. A wooden ladder descended into darkness. The air that wafted up was cold and damp, carrying an unfamiliar metallic tang. It was unsettling, but I couldn't resist. I grabbed my flashlight and climbed down. The cellar was small, with stone walls and a dirt floor. Shelves lined one wall, filled with old jars and rusted tools. In the center of the room was a wooden crate. It was large, almost like a coffin, and bound with iron bands. My heart pounded as I approached it. What could be inside? With a deep breath, I pried open the crate. Inside, wrapped in a stained cloth, was a collection of old journals. They looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. I pulled one out and opened it, flipping through pages filled with cramped, handwritten text. It seemed to be a record of the cabin's previous owner, detailing his life in the woods, his isolation, and increasingly erratic thoughts about someone, or something, watching him. A noise from above startled me. It sounded like a footstep. I froze, listening intently. Another step, then another. Someone was in the cabin. I turned off my flashlight, plunging the cellar into darkness. My breathing was shallow, my pulse racing. I couldn't stay down here, trapped. Slowly I climbed the ladder, peeking through the trapdoor. In the dim light filtering through the broken windows, I saw a man. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with unkempt hair and a beard that seemed to have been left to grow wild. He wore a flannel shirt and jeans, both dirty and torn. He was rummaging through my backpack, muttering to himself. I stayed hidden, hoping he wouldn't notice the trapdoor. But then he paused. tilting his head as if listening. My heart sank as he turned and locked eyes with me. He grinned, a slow, malicious smile that sent a chill down my spine. "Well, look what we have here," he said, his voice rough and mocking. "Come on up, don't be shy." I didn't move, my mind racing. If I stayed down here, he could trap me. If I went up, who knew what he'd do? I had no weapon, nothing to defend myself with. My flashlight was the closest thing to a weapon I had, and that wouldn't do much good. "All right, have it your way," he said, moving toward the trapdoor. I had no choice. I scrambled up the ladder, trying to push past him. He grabbed me, yanking me up and throwing me to the floor. The journals scattered, pages fluttering like wounded birds. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice steadier than I felt. "Name's Travis," he said, kicking the trapdoor shut. "This is my cabin. What are you doing here?" "I was just exploring," I said, struggling to sit up. "I didn't know anyone lived here." He laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "No one lives here, not anymore. But it's still mine." I glanced around, looking for an escape. The door was behind him, my backpack by his feet. He followed my gaze and kicked the backpack aside. "You're not going anywhere," he said, pulling a knife from his belt. The blade glinted in the dim light, and my stomach twisted with fear. "Look, I don't want any trouble," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "I'll just leave, and you can have your cabin back." He shook his head. "Too late for that. You've seen too much." Before I could react, he lunged at me, the knife slashing through the air. I rolled to the side, narrowly avoiding the blade. My hand brushed against something hard and cold, the flashlight. I grabbed it and swung it at him, hitting his wrist. He yelped, dropping the knife. I didn't wait. I scrambled to my feet and bolted for the door, grabbing my backpack on the way. Travis roared in anger and chased after me. I burst out of the cabin and into the woods, running as fast as I could. The trees blurred past, branches scratching at my face and arms. I could hear Travis behind me crashing through the underbrush. I had to find a way to lose him. Up ahead I saw a fallen tree, its roots jutting out like a natural barricade. I veered toward it, hoping to use it to my advantage. I leapt over the tree and crouched behind it, trying to catch my breath. Travis thundered past, not noticing my hiding spot. I waited until his footsteps faded before climbing out and making my way back to the camp as quietly as possible. When I reached my RV, I locked the doors and grabbed my keys. I had to get out of there before Travis realized his mistake. I started the engine and tore out of the campsite, my heart pounding. I drove for hours, not stopping until I reached a small town. I parked in a well-lit lot and sat there trying to calm down. My hands were shaking and my mind was racing. What the hell had just happened? Who was Travis and why was he so hell-bent on keeping that cabin a secret? As I sat there, I remembered the journals. They were still in the cellar. I couldn't go back, but maybe, just maybe, someone else could. I pulled out my phone and typed up a quick message to the local authorities, explaining what had happened and where they could find the cabin. It was the best I could do. I just hoped it was enough. Felix Reinhardt signing off.